unusual situation in that a group of us are part of a Plato reading group and know each other pretty well. Roberto is coming in to that little fixed group.
Welcome.
and
Welcome.
Phil is here to observe us and think deep thoughts and make good suggestions. But I think we better get going because we've got some wonderful papers. Sorry, my throat is going on me. Let's go ahead and use the order on the agenda in terms of socio, and that would put Ron first, doing Platonic dialogue and the joys of synthesis. And he's sharing the screen, and we have tech. Hi, tech. Ron, thank you for being here, and tell us what you have to share.
Okay. Thank you, Paige, for chairing, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Little change in title: Platonic Dialogue and the Necessity of Dialectic, as the writing of this sort of changed the direction just a little bit. So it may not be necessary to say to the attenders of this panel that there's already been much said about rhetoric and the dialogues of Phaedrus and Gorgius. It's probably also unnecessary that Plato's stance on rhetoric has been disputed, as rhetoric scholars appear to remain divided on the subject, some arguing that Plato advances a positive view of rhetoric, a dialectical possibility in some cases, or a true rhetoric in other places. Other scholars, and I would count myself in this category, pretty much take Plato at his word on the subject of rhetoric. Rhetoric is pig shit, if I may adapt Artaud for this purpose, and its practitioners are pigs rooting around in the muck of usefulness, marketability, and other practical matters that philosophers would be wiser to avoid. Even as someone who has chosen to dedicate his career to the study of rhetoric, I haven't found it necessary to stretch the definition so obsessively far that it has to include Plato's philosophical practices for me to be comfortable with my own life choices. In this presentation, then, I will put aside the question of rhetoric's role in Plato, and I will focus instead on one particular place where rhetoric and dialectic seem to serve as counterparts, that is, in stasis theory, and investigate the way that intersection plays out in actual practice. In A Modern Theory of Stasis, Michael Hopman notes that the intricacies of classical stasis theory have mostly been lost by contemporary rhetoricians who have tended to create a general heuristic that can be used in almost any case. One so general, in fact, as to become almost useless. I share Hopman's concern about stasis theory. Where Hopman hopes to revive stasis theory by looking at particular legal cases, however, I hope to contribute to this cause by finding a more usable pedagogical theory of stasis. In this regard, I also join K.A. Rain's project of using stasis theory to teach students the art of dialectic, but with one friendly emendation. Where Rain rightly points out that in the Platonic dialogues we often use rhetoric, that we often use for rhetoric study or ripe for analysis, I want to argue that students should learn to construct stasis theory-driven dialogues themselves in order to most effectively engage the productive power of stasis theory. So I just want to move beyond analysis and into the production of dialogues. Before suggesting how we might encourage students to write these dialogues, a quick gloss of Phaedrus and Gorgias might help establish the context in which the assignments took place. In the Phaedrus, we see Socrates define 3 different kinds of madness and ultimately argue that love is the superior kind. In the first half of Gorgias, we see Socrates take his interlocutors through various definitions of happiness to ultimately argue for the best use of rhetoric, namely to keep oneself, one's family, and one's friends away from doing wrong. Before I assigned students this assignment, we spent time discussing these ideas and the form that Plato used to write them. And as Rain predicts, when I ask students on online discussion boards to identify the places where Socrates asked his interlocutors to define their terms and to discuss the quality of various definitions, they were generally able to do so quite well. Though I did find it interesting to discover that they were able to do so more readily in Gorgias than they were in Phaedrus. Once students had thoroughly developed their analysis of the dialogue, I then gave my students the assignment that I'm not going to read all the way through it. I suspect that it's because it's been up there, you've already kind of taken a look at it. But I gave them this assignment and kind of used this formal structure to kind of guide them both creatively and formally. And I was going to go through 3 different examples, but I'm just terrified of Paige's whip here, keep me on time. So I'm just going to focus on example number 3, and then if we want to go back and talk about some of the other examples, we can do that. But I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for discussion of all my colleagues' work. So I'll just quickly say about this first example that it was sort of interesting thing here emerged here because the student used his knowledge of Lao Tzu to just introduce that person as a character, right? So that didn't come out of the class at all. But that is one thing I've noticed about teaching dialogues is that students do tend to bring in things they know into the course when you have them create characters in a dialogue, and that's kind of interesting, I think. And I'd love to say more about this one, but let's not focus on this one right now. Even though that one's about love, I think anyone that's about love makes sense in regard to Phaedrus. But I thought we would just focus just to kind of be clear and focused. We focus on this example. So the student's is in the professor's office. Professor says, "I called you in today to discuss your thoughts about a recent problem. I've been noticing that more and more of my students are spending time texting or sleeping in my class. Do you, as a student, feel like this is okay?" Student says, "Well, of course I do. No offense to you, professor, but I did pay to take the class I'm texting or sleeping in." And then this is early draft, right? The prof says, "I can understand that, but there's also the matter of respecting your professor during the class." So I chose this example in particular because I thought it really kind of underscores this tendency that we have when making arguments, I think sometimes maybe to concede a point too easy, and that the dialogue itself kind of as a form gave me a really interesting opportunity to, instead of maybe correcting the student in terms of the content, right, to kind of go to the form, to simply say, well, let's ask ourselves, would the professor concede this point so quickly? Or, what I asked the student to do is, wouldn't the professor move us to definition, right? And ask the question, what does it mean to pay to take a class, right? And where does that take us? And the case that I want to make, or kind of the thing I want to throw out here, is that in all 3 of the cases that I presented, I was able to move students forward, but in ways that are ultimately more ethical, because they do not assert a position, but instead to move the student to further define their terms. So the student next draft, right, and I don't have a slide for this, but I'll just kind of walk you through it. So the student, after kind of putting that little bit of pressure, next draft, when the professor asks, well, what does it mean to pay to take a class? The student says, well, it means that I have certain rights within that class, that I can do with my time what I wish. And if I fail to get the information I'm supposed to get, that's on me. But that the professor does not have a right to enforce additional penalties on me that go beyond that. So in that regard, then the student wanted to immediately let the professor concede there, but really all I had to do was say, let's push it a little further, and not telling the student what to think. The student in the next draft then said, Instead of having this professor concede the point again, further prompting eventually led the student to have the professor raise questions about the effect that texting on class can have on other students in the class, which eventually led to a question about respect for others in the class rather than just respect for the professor. What I found particularly meaningful, and I'm just going to wrap up with this, what I found particularly meaningful about this interchange over the course of drafts was that I did not have to raise the arguments themselves, but simply point the student to the rules of stasis. Without telling the student what to think, but how to do so, the student ultimately reached stasis with this particular imagined professor, where the student agreed to only answer text messages on her phone under conditions that related to her family, and the professor agreed that he would take grades off of the table based on a discussion of goodwill, respect, and trust. So with this scenario, I am representing one of the better cases. And I do want to make it clear that I very often struggle to keep students adhering to the rules of stasis. Even when stasis arguments are modeled and guided through multiple drafts, students very often write dialogues that reflect the ways that arguments proceed in reality, where rather than adhering to the rules of stasis, characters make moves to help them win the day, rather than delve deeper into knowledge about any particular topic. Any scholar of Plato knows, however, that Plato wasn't immune from this tendency himself. So when assessing a dialogue on the whole, a teacher has to decide how far the dialectical process has to cut. This is not cause for lament, though, but likely serves as a case for dialectical instruction instead. Thanks. That's it, Paige.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. And I should have mentioned, I was derelict in my duty, that Ron is a professor at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Right? Our next speaker, and by all means, jot down questions as they occur to you, because we're going to leave them all for the end, if that's okay with the group. Our next speaker is on another sheet of paper. Rose is next. The Platonic Soul of Belles Lettres by Rosaline Keefe. And Rosaline is a professor at Old Dominion University in Virginia, which is right up the street from me. I can almost see it from here.
Yeah, I can see you actually, Paige.
Oh,
Hi, everybody.
Rose.
So this paper is an offering of ideas for discussion and debate, because I know that it would not be an immediately acceptable, might be word, idea to juxtapose Smith and Plato. But I'm going to throw this at you and see if I can do it. Okay. So this paper is about the Theaetetus in general, Plato's dialogue in which he develops, expands, and ultimately discards three major theories of knowledge. Traditionally, the triad of theories explored are that knowledge is perception, or that knowledge is true judgment, or that knowledge is true judgment with account. There are many ways of reading and explaining the Theaetetus, and from the perspective of one interested in the 18th century, I think I could spend several books just thinking about his critique of sensory perception as the basis of knowledge. But this paper is actually looking at the relationship between Plato's dialogue about what knowledge is not and what Adam Smith's theory of moral knowledge is. Both, I would suggest, arrive at the conclusion that there's no formula, only various methods available to aid in inquiry. And the end is not actual knowledge, but practice, and not practice only. In Smith's case of virtue, and in Plato's case of philosophy, or one could say of both wisdom, but better in improving, moving towards better practice of those things. In both, ultimately, it's a philosophy of learning, I think. So Plato ends the Theaetetus with a beautifully moving passage in which he admits defeat. Well then, he tells Theaetetus, our art of midwifery tells us that all of these offspring are wind eggs and not worth bringing up. Undoubtedly, the game teenager replies, And so, Socrates continues, Theaetetus, if ever in the future you should attempt to conceive or should succeed in conceiving other theories, they will be better ones as the result of this inquiry. And if you remain barren, your companions will find you gentler and less tiresome. You'll be modest and not think you know what you do not know. That is all my art can achieve, nothing more. I think that there are two things that strike me in this passage. First, that the point of the inquiry was not to actually achieve knowledge at all, in either the sense of putting more birds in your bird cage or producing imprints on the wax that will yield knowledge in the future. Those things happened over the course of the dialogue. We gained birds and imprints, but those don't yield necessarily a final product. Knowledge is a product, knowledge as a product, in fact, wasn't the point at all. It was the process which, when undertaken, produces better inquiry for the next time. Else, I think we would be closer to achieving states of perfect government, perfect education, world peace, deep personal contentment. And I don't see that any process brings us permanently closer to any of those things. Ergo, the process Plato describes isn't so much a process because it's cumulative. Rather, the next set of theories will be sharper because the tools have been honed, the chords have been practiced, the tones are recognized. The inquiry is better because it's a better inquiry. It's more beautiful. The second striking thing from that ending in the Theaetetus is that the end of inquiry is affective, or rather, it affects the hallmarks of wisdom, gentleness and humility that come from moral development. Could it be that there's an idea of moral development manifested in affect that was one of the points of Socrates' lesson? The motive of the affective shift here is learning through philosophical inquiry not to think that you know what you do not know. As he shows in the Sophist and other works, there's always room for error. And it is this insight that I would like to align with Smith's idea of the process and conditions for moral knowledge. So here's his central passage from Theory of Moral Sentiments, and I'll throw it in the chat so that we all have it to look at. He says, the wise and virtuous man directs his principal attention to the first standard, the idea of exact propriety and perfection. There exists in the mind of every man an idea of this kind, gradually formed from his observation upon the character and conduct both of himself and other people. It is slow, gradual, and progressive work of the great demigod within the breast, the great judge and arbiter of conduct. This idea is in every man more or less accurately drawn. Its coloring is more or less just, its outlines more or less exactly designed, according to the delicacy and acuteness of that sensibility with which those observations were made, and according to the care and attention employed in making them. In the wise and virtuous man, they have been made with the most acute care and sensibility, and the utmost care and attention employed in making them. The idea that delicateness and acuteness of observation is what determines the alignment of the internal judge's justness to the idea of exact perfection, which is obviously an ideal and not an actual standard, requires the same process of philosophical education that Socrates describes to Theaetetus. Earlier in the dialogue, Socrates tells Theaetetus what a good education looks like, the opposite of a rhetorical one. Philosophical education, he explains, differs from a rhetorical one because the philosopher asks, what is man? What actions and passions belong properly to human nature and distinguish it from all things? This is what he wants to know and concerns himself to investigate. In both those cases, then, the appropriate content is the study of human nature, found in what human nature produces, actions and passions. And the methods are also the same, a philosophical process by which, through increasingly close distinctions, our faculties of judgment can be better exercised. In both, there's an ideal form which guides the inquiry. In both, distinctions and comparisons are the means through which more acuteness is achieved. But whereas the Platonic model of a philosophical education is unconstrained conversations and dialogue, unconstrained by time and external approval, constraints of that sort, Smith puts the student instead in conversation with literature, substituting the study of ballet for the practice of argument for the purposes of first developing in a rhetoric classroom a practice of criticism meant to refine faculties of taste and judgment of human actions and passions. Smith's concept of ballet is actually a particularly Smithian moral philosophy of rhetoric, one that offers literary criticism as an essential feature and function of the moral economy of sentiments necessary to the formation of an integrated and mature moral actor or citizen. The phenomena of ballet must be understood in the philosophical context from which Smith developed it, in particular, the classical understanding of the rhetorical concept of to prepon or proprietas, which refers to rhetorical appropriateness, but is also closely connected to the moral state of character hexis, formed by habit. In Enlightenment Scotland, this concept was used to form a robust conceptualization of fittingness or taste, which in turn underpinned the pedagogical practice of reading literature in the rhetoric classroom, in a curricular space that had previously been reserved for oratory. So Smith says in the lectures on rhetoric and ballet that, quote, when the sentiment of the speaker is addressed in a neat, clear, plain, and clever manner, and the passion or affection he is possessed of intends by sympathy to communicate to his hearer, is cleverly and plainly hit off, then and only then has it the force and beauty that language can give it. The beauty flows from the sentiment and the method of expressing it being suitable to the passion. To understand what sympathy means in this context is to inflect that the key moral insight of the demigod in the breast from theory of moral sentiments is that we are one among many. In other words, the art of criticizing propriety and perfection in literature or language artifacts or other people's actions is exercising what I would argue is the philosophical art of criticism, and it has the same effects as Socrates' hope for Theaetetus, to be gentler and less tiresome, and to know what you do not know. I'm going to end that there, so that there's lots of time for questions.
Thank you, Rose, very much. And we've had a few more folks join us. There's Michael. Hello. Michael, I'm waving at you. Michael, you've fallen in among folks from Norfolk, Virginia and Alabama, Patrick Shaw down here, and New Jersey. But we're in a Plato group. So you've fallen in among thieves of a certain kind. Okay.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Friends, I'm going to read my paper in the old-fashioned lazy way and hope I can do it quickly enough. My title is A Kinder, Gentler Socrates. Actually, our friend David Metzger, also in this session here, gave me that. Socrates in and through the looking glass of Plato's Theaetetus. And I begin always with epigraphs. And these are both from Theaetetus. Yes, come along, Theaetetus. I want to see for myself what sort of face I have. Theodorus says, I am like you. Those are Socrates' very first words to Theaetetus. And the second epigraph is from later on. Socrates also to Theaetetus, for handsome is as handsome does. Okay, Plato's Socrates may be the best known and most highly esteemed version of the barefoot sage, but as self-appointed gadfly of Athenian society, self-described as everyone knows in the Apology, Socrates has a veritable swarm of identities. The historical, sometimes malodorous figure who actually lived from 469 to 399. The obnoxious Aristophanian Socrates featured in The Clouds and other plays. The benign xenophonic Socrates, the soldier historian Xenophon, lived 430 to 354 BCE. The matured Socrates, which is discussed particularly by Leo Strauss, as being found in the Persian Muhammad Zakaria al-Razi, and the hundreds of other Socrateses created by the remarks of Nietzsche and other philosophers and readers. So that's just a look at a small swarm of gadflies, all of them Socrates. So puzzlingly disparate are these versions of Socrates that the whole matter of distinguishing them, and more importantly, figuring out how, as a historical literary character, he even exists in our collective unconscious, has, as many ACTC folks know, its own name, the Socratic Problem. Plato's 369 BCE dialogue, Theaetetus, however, offers us a unique perspective on the Socratic problem because it involves the often truculent Socrates' surprisingly warm interaction with a gifted 16-year-old youth. And I loved Rose's phrase, a game teenager. That was a great phrase. And that's, of course, Theaetetus, who is both as physically unattractive and as soulfully brilliant as Socrates himself. And thus my insistence on the mirror motif in the title of this presentation. The chief question considered in the dialogue is a serious one. What is knowledge? One might also add the more implicit question, what is beauty? Answered in the second epigraph I just gave you, handsome is as handsome says. The main knowledge question is never answered definitively by either Socrates or his young interlocutor. Perhaps this apparent lack of resolution makes this late dialogue a bit of an also-ran compared to the Republic or the Symposium, the Phaedrus, or other greatest hits of Plato. Non-classicist, non-philosopher, non-rhetorician that I am, I find the Theaetetus and all Platonic dialogues somewhat baffling and exasperating. But I also find Theaetetus a strangely endearing portrait of Socrates, so close to his demise in 399, and a good summation of his thought and method for non-specialists, because it presents truth and morality dramatically dramatized in a human relationship. Here, a bond I consider paternal and filial in nature. The dialogue's most famous metaphor, one might even call it a literary conceit, is Socrates' insisting that he is only a midwife to Theaetus' ideas, which must live or die at birth, depending on their own life force. Plato rivals John Donne in his working and extension of the midwife trope in unexpected and clever ways. There are, of course, other metaphors used, the wax block and the aviary among them, but the midwife relates directly to Socrates' own mother, whose womanly role he has unabashedly assumed, and indirectly to two unstated cultural myths, the birth of Athena from Zeus's head, and the appearance of Athena as mentor to Telemachus in Homer's The Odyssey. The mentor figure in the Theaetetus is, of course, Socrates himself, placing Theaetetus into the role of Telemachus, the boy with a chronically absent father. That much seems straightforward, but Socrates himself bears an equally compelling likeness to the absent father in the Odyssey, that smarty pants Odysseus. How often do we hear from Plato or Xenophon or Aristophanes or any other of the chroniclers of Socrates about Socrates' own familial relations with his wife Xanithope and their three sons, Lamprocles and Sophroniscus and Menexenus. I'm probably saying those wrong. I may simply be ignorant of such materials about his family, or they may have been lost to time, but I think the answer is we don't hear much about his own family. Perhaps Socrates, nearing the end of his odd career, is reconsidering his own and family life in general. That is, thinking of motherhood, his own fatherhood, sonhood, and the passing on of what is most needed by humanity's progeny. Socrates seems to me to model the stance that good adults should readily stand in loco parentis to young people. This presentation therefore focuses on the way Socrates coddles and chastens his precious, precocious young interlocutor, Dioetes, destined to be a famous mathematician, whom Socrates clearly sees as both a mirror image, we might say the spitting image of himself, and as a spiritual son seeking his own identity on the other side of the looking glass. The Dioetes is again a supremely dramatic example of the Platonic dialogue form, with perhaps the most thorough characterizations of the main speakers, both Socrates and young Dioetes, in the whole Platonic canon. Excuse me, I've got to get my answering machine to hush up. There we go. The dialogue's drama prompts in me as well a rare imagined glimpse of Plato serving as the de facto playwright and stage director just off stage in the wings of the text. Excuse me. Moving quickly through the dialogue itself, one finds many examples of the dramatic relationship building that Socrates is both modeling and advocating in this encounter with Dioetes. First, consider the frame. Like Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, this is by all appearances a partial frame narrative, the setup at the beginning not being mentioned again at the end. Or is the frame perhaps completed implicitly by history itself, that is, the impending trial and death of Socrates? Back to that thought later on. At the dialogue's start, we meet Euclides and Terpsion, who had notably been seeking one another's company without success until a fortuitous meeting. Euclides tells his friend and us that he has just met Dioetes, quote, being taken to Athens from the camp at Corinth, unquote. Dioetes, badly wounded from heroic action in battle and deathly ill with dysentery from the army's camp, has insisted on going to his own home, evidence perhaps of how he reveres his own nuclear family. Why tell us all this? The frame foreseeing the imminent death of Dioetes in a dialogue foreseeing the imminent death of Socrates, yes, clearly tells us this same character, whom we are about to meet in his youth, will become a fine man, an admired mathematician, and a loyal Athenian who will sacrifice self for others. Socrates, whom Euclides considered a prophet when it came to judging people, had correctly praised and then helped to shape Dioetes' great potential while he was still young. Euclides, having a copy of Socrates and Dioetes' first encounter dialogue, proposes to Terpsion that they have a slave read it out to them as they rest, completing the partial frame for the upcoming core of our core text. The tiny detail that it is a slave who reads what follows tells us that literacy alone will not protect one from a life of servitude in an imperfect Greek social system based on wealth and class. Of paramount importance, however, is our foreknowledge of the teenage Dioetes' eventual success, both as a thinker and Athenian war hero. That backgrounding was and is the real reason for the frame. The main dialogue then begins, and the next voices we hear are those of Socrates and Theodorus, Theaetetus's teacher, who first absolves himself of any suspicion he erotically favors the remarkable young man in question by saying the boy is unattractive in appearance, rather like you, Socrates, snub-nosed with eyes that stick out. After bashing Theaetetus's looks, however, Theodorus proceeds to give his student as glowing a recommendation as was ever submitted to Harvard Law School by a favorite faculty member. Here is what we learn. The young man Socrates is about to meet is quick, but has a, quote, unusually gentle temper, unquote. Theodorus continues, and to crown it all, he is as manly a boy as any of his fellows. Even in a society which grudgingly accepts pederasty as a cultural norm, Theodorus seems delighted that Theaetetus, unlike some gifted young men, is not fey in his mannerisms. Socrates knows the boy's father, Euphronius of Sunium, now deceased, which makes Theaetetus a fatherless son. Socrates pronounces the young man a thoroughbred, evidently, a phrase with odd equine or even eugenic overtones to modern ears. Socrates asks the boy to be called over and plunges right into discussion with him. Yes, come along, Theaetetus. I want to see for myself what sort of face I have. Theodorus says, I'm like you. What a challenging, wry first line to start a mentorship. Before Theaetetus can even respond, Socrates continues with a proffered hypothetical case about whether the tuning of an instrument can be trusted, untried, even if someone, possibly a musician, possibly not, has vouched for it. Theaetetus answers his first words to the great Socrates, oh, we should have inquired into that. A good response that might be glossed as one should trust in people, such as musicians, but politely verify their credentials. Theaetetus is immediately caught up in a flurry of questions from Socrates, all of which he adroitly parries or answers with both frankness and deference to his elder, the great man. The young man is both smart and modest. In just a page or so, Socrates has posed the big question, what is knowledge, and proposed that the two of them make a game out of answering it, a game he calls Donkey and King, after some child's entertainment where one player is disadvantaged and wrong, therefore the donkey, and another is advantaged and right, therefore the king. But the questions involved are far from childish, since now the big question, what is knowledge, is at stake. Theaetetus jumps right into both the spirit and high level of the game. His first time out for a breather is to introduce his own young friend, who, though unrelated, shares a name with Socrates, another kind of mirroring. This young man, whom we shall get to know somewhat better in The Statesman, is here in this dialogue to remind us that Theaetetus really is a 16-year-old boy with his own peers in the gymnasium where the dialogue is set. Theaetetus is quick to credit Socrates' young namesake, his buddy, with their co-discovery of what they have dubbed square versus oblong numbers. Impressed with the young man's mathematical acumen and creativity, as well as his generosity to his friend, Socrates moves on to present his midwife metaphor. Theaetetus has heard before that Socrates' mother was a midwife. Socrates is, after all, an Athenian celebrity with a rep, but Theaetetus is soon to learn much more about midwifery and philosophy than he ever could have expected. Socrates insists that he, a midwife of ideas, is a humble figure barren of ideas of his own. Both he and Theaetetus, of course, know better, but both go along politely with Socrates' rhetorical premise and its flourishes. They move on to discuss Theaetetus' first answer to Socrates' what is knowledge, which is knowledge is. Socrates lists Protagoras, Heraclitus, Empedocles, all with the purpose of getting Theaetetus to see eventually the flaws in their ideas, which he does. The Heraclitan idea that knowledge involves flux and motion is also weighed and found wanting. What is just as important as the philosophical content of the young man's replies, however, is the warmth and logic of his phrasing and manner. Socrates often calls the boy, the young man, my son or my lad, and praises his efforts, even when flawed, assuming a tone of like-spirited warmth and nurturing. Socrates becomes mentor, and wily Odysseus rolled into one, with even a bit of Penelope's mothering thrown in. And almost done now. Though this paper does not begin to do justice to the philosophical content of the dialogue, the sophists are discussed, the school of motion is given a good whacking, Theodorus comes and goes, Theaetetus resumes his role as an interlocutor, Socrates even throws a couple of sophist-like fits of hair splitting. Justice and truth come into it as they must. But throughout it all, Socrates and Theaetetus speak to one another with growing warmth and respect. Theaetetus takes every defeat well and asks for more. We get a new definition of knowledge that involves judgment and later judgment plus an account, whatever that is. And we odd new extended metaphors, the aviary and the wax block. We look at monism, we get even some jokes by Socrates at his own expense. Definitions fall apart, but the center, the verbal bond between ugly Socrates and ugly young Theaetetus holds beautifully. Both men's souls and characters, in both senses of the word, moral and theatrical character, have been improved. Neither wisdom nor knowledge has sprung into being unaided from mighty Zeus's head. It has instead been born from the intercourse of true minds, mentorship in the best ancient and contemporary sense of the word. Thank you. Okay. So now we're going to hear from Roberto. Roberto, would you like to tell us when you begin to talk, where you teach and so forth? Need to remind us of that. And your title, unless you've changed it, Death as a Reflection of Life, Notes from Plato's Philosophy. Is that still your title?
Yeah,
okay.
It's still. So I'm going to share a screen. I'm going to read my paper I prepared for this reading, and so that we can all read it together. You wanted me to tell where I'm teaching. I teach at the University Panamericana in Mexico City. I'm in the Humanities Department. And here in Panamericana, we have a type of Cortex program. So we use this, and I'm going to share, well, it's a paper I prepared, and that I was thinking about how can Cortex, in this case Plato, can help students go through a crisis like this one. So if I may, health crisis like the one we are living right now thanks to COVID-19 triggers the most primitive fear in people, death. Death's accuracy is evident more than ever for many of us. It is clear, or at least we think it is, that we are all going to die. We have been experiencing death all our whole life through relatives, friends, colleagues, pets, and plants. Death is all around us. The fear of death is embodied in us because of our animal nature. We flee from it every time. But we, as humans, face death not like an animal who seems to not be aware of it, as Heidegger believes, but as rational beings that are conscious of it. And our awareness makes us wonder, what could it be? The dilemma about it is one we will never be able to solve, for when death comes, as Epicurus tells us, we won't be there. Nevertheless, the uncertainty, sorry for that, the uncertainty of what will happen afterwards is real. We face two options. 1, death is nothing, the end of existence, or 2, death is the continuation of life. Both alternatives have risks. In the first one, we face with nothingness, the end of consciousness, the end of the self. On the other hand, if there is an afterlife, there is still nothing clear about it. I can list at least 3 questions raised from the second option. What type of life do we have in the afterlife? Will there be an examination of my life after death? Who or whom will be in charge of this examination? I believe that core texts can help us deal with the uncertainty of death. In particular, Plato's dialogues are of great help when dealing with such questions. In this presentation, I will hit 3 dialogues with which we find some ideas concerning death that I believe will help anyone that get a different perspective. The first one I will call out is an idea found in Apology. Quote, to fear death, gentlemen, is nothing else than to think one is wise when one is not. For it is thinking one knows what does not know. For no one knows whether death be not even the greatest of all blessings to man, but they fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of all evils. End of quote. Socrates begins his sentence by saying to fear death. As we know, Apology is about Socrates' trial and sentence to death. He is pointing out that he is not afraid of dying, but at the same time, he is calling everyone who fears death unwise, for they are practicing the ignorance that Socrates is well known for trying to avoid on himself and others. His Maiotic is all about being able to exercise all the false wisdom one has. Let us remember that when Socrates calls on ignorance as one of the evils, he is talking about one precise type of ignorance, the arrogant one. Using Socrates' words, this is the most apprehensible form of ignorance, that of thinking one knows what one does not know. Many may get offended, as the jury in Athens got, when you call someone ignorant, but let us not get carried away. Ignorance is a big deal. Thinking we know what we actually don't know is harmful for ourselves and others. This is precisely what Socrates is trying to stress out when calling everyone who fears death ignorant. His intention is not humiliation, but enlightenment. Let us go through the to fear death thought. Do we know what death is? If the answer is yes, what do we know about death? In Phaedrus, it is defined as the separation between the body and the soul. What else do we know about it? As Socrates himself says lines ahead, death can't be anything else but that. Can it? Following Plato's definition of death, it is possible to add that death is what happens to the soul when it separates from the body. About this idea in particular, I'm going to address it a little bit further. If, on the other hand, the answer is no, then Socrates probably has a point in his statement. We don't know what death is. So this fulfills the need of something that we think we know, but we don't. Fear is an emotion rooted in the future. We fear what is not here, but the evil that we imagine could be here anytime soon. The emotion is real, but is the source of it real? What can be done? The suggestion we find in Apology is that we should not fear death, for we don't really know what it is. We are assuming death is something, and on consequence of that, we experience this emotion, fear. With it comes anxiety. A first step fighting anxiety of death is understanding we really don't know what we think death is. Maybe, as Socrates points out, it is a blessing and not an evil. There is another idea found in Apology on behalf of this topic. After Socrates is found guilty of all charges and condemned to drink the poison, he talks about death once again. His words are, quote, let us consider in another way also how good reason there is to hope that death, is a good thing. For the state of death is one of two things. Either it is virtually nothingness, so that the dead has no perception or understanding of anything, or it is, as people say, a change and migration of the soul from this to another place. End of quote. In Socrates' mind, death is nothing to be afraid of, nor experimenting anxiety or panic attacks. He is showing a way to understand it. First, he told us that we should not be afraid of it since we don't know for a fact what it is. Then he rationalizes it by sharing his thoughts, for death is either a long dream for from which we won't have any perception of, or the third option, death is a transmutation of the soul from one place to another. And using Socrates' words, we can encapsulate everything by saying that we can hope that it is a good thing. He is bargaining between fear and hope. Death now can be seen through a different perspective. Hope. What this alternative is offering is the possibility to think death without pain. With fear comes suffering, but with hope, we have expectance. This expectance can ease the suffering by considering death a moment free from all pain. To be able to understand this, one must first need to untie death from fear. To do so is to be courageous and moderate. As Plato points out in Republic, the task of eradicating the conception of death as something evil or harmful begins with the contents given to the children when educating them. Like the verses from Homer Plato shares when Achilles is saying that he would rather be a serf on the land of a poor and portionless man than to rule over all the dead who have come to naught. If a hero like Achilles believes the afterworld is nothing and makes a statement like the one just read, how can anyone think of death as something good? And Plato's point is quite relevant, for if anyone fears death, courage is impossible. If courage is impossible, the whole possibility of justice is compromised. I am not going to follow that road in this paper, for my aim is to understand how Plato's philosophy can help any human being address the fear of death. I am aware that Socrates' third conception of death can bring its own complication. For if death is a transition from this place to another, what type of transition are we talking about? Are we going to be examined? What if we fail the test? Will our souls be condemned? All these questions will be answered in Phaedrus, Gorgias, and in Book 10 of Republic. Before doing so, I would like to say something else about Socrates' conception of death. In Crito, we witness the courage of facing death by Socrates. Let us remember that after the death penalty, Socrates had to stay in jail before the ship from Delos arrived to Athens. Until then, no death penalty could be executed. So Socrates is in jail, and his friend Crito comes to tell him that he had already bribed the prison guard for Socrates' escape. And Crito finds himself astonished of how easily and calm was Socrates sleeping, even though he was facing the death penalty. And Socrates' response is one we should think about. It would be absurd if at my age I were disturbed because I must die. Now, the Greek word for absurd in this sentence is phlemeles, which primarily means out of tune. Even though this is a Socratic dialogue, I cannot but think of a musical metaphor, for everyone is clear how much Plato appreciated music for his pedagogical system and the vast number of musical metaphors in his works. This is why I am proposing changing absurd for out of tune. The translation can now be read like, it will be out of tune if at my age I were disturbed because I must die. This modification can give us a hint of what is really going on here. Socrates is described by Plato as the best and wisest and most righteous man. From Book 4 of Republic, we know that justice is the principle of doing one's own business, also known as oikoiopragia, meaning the proper functioning of anything. Therefore, a just human being is whomever functions properly. In Plato, this would mean that the tripartite soul does their job as they are meant to. Reason must command, anger must obey and ally reason, and appetite should maintain the body alive and be able to motivate the person through tough tasks. When fulfilling this, the soul of the person will be in complete harmony and balance. In other words, it will be in tune, just like Socrates is telling Crito he is. Being in tune also implies having the natural virtues for each part of the soul. For appetite, moderation; for anger, courage; and for reason, wisdom. As commented above, one cannot have courage if fear of death is present. By saying he is in tune, Socrates is, or Plato himself, making us aware of the fact that this is a proof of rightness and wisdom he will defend in Crito. He cannot prefer to go through an injustice rather than being unjust by escaping from jail if courage was absent from his soul. Justice is the consequence of developing the three virtues just mentioned. When we learn from this sentence in Crito, what we can learn from this sentence in Crito is that any person who has worked their moral system can understand death without fear. I would like to go back to Plato's definition of death given in Phaedrus, the release and separation of the soul from the body. As told before, this is what we know about death from Plato's point of view. Death is but a release and separation of the soul from the body. This brings us to account that body and soul are two different entities. In fact, in this dialogue, we understand that the body and soul are in a community. This is a koinonia. I will go back to this idea in a moment. Before, let's consider the definition just given. Knowing that dying is the process where our soul separates from our body changes anything? Does it ease any fear? Not for a fact. Instead, it rises the fear even more, as Gibbs mentions, that when a man dies, the soul is dispersed, and this is the end of his existence. Understanding death as the separation between body and soul does not solve the problem. That is the reason why Plato needs to prove the immortality of the soul. If the soul is not immortal, what case can we make about good behavior? And of course, the anxiety of living can get even worse. But at the beginning of Phaedrus, Plato opens a window towards his understanding when saying that people engaged in philosophy should be confident about death. Socrates' exact words are, quote, "A man who has really spent his life in philosophy is naturally of good courage when he is to die, and has strong hopes that when he is dead, he will attain the greatest blessing in that other land." He also tells us this in Gorgias at the Final Myth and at the Final Myth of Phaedrus and Republic 10. Obviously, to accept this proposition, one must first acknowledge the immortality of the soul. At the end of the dialogue, after numerous approaches of why the soul is immortal, Plato guides us through the final argument where he concludes the immortality of the soul. Not going to dissect the premises of this argument, I have done that elsewhere, just brought it up here as an endoxa that could help explain better why Plato believes we should not be afraid of death. Immortality of the soul is proven, but not why every person engaged in philosophy should not worry about dying. And what can we do to anyone who is not a philosopher? It seems discriminatory to say that anyone engaged in philosophy should not worry about dying, for there will be great blessings in afterlife for such persons. The answer to it pops right ahead of us. Other people are likely not to be aware that those who pursue haptomenoi, philosophy or right, study nothing but dying and being dead. The key word here is haptomenoi, which besides pursuing can also mean engaging, fastening, undertaking, or even apprehend. Let us remember that in Plato's time, there weren't bachelor's degrees that licensed you as an engineer, architect, mathematician, medic, or philosopher. In Republic, Plato defines the philosophers as the ones able to grasp the eternal and unchangeable. He is aiming towards the study of ideas. Anyone engaged in the study of the world in a metaphysical and ontological point of view is a philosopher. This means that every person pursuing the task can be called a philosopher. In a sense, we are all philosophers, since there is not a single person that has not pursued the meaning of life in a transcendental way. That is, trying to explain the ever-changing world into a Parmenidean way. But there is another thing that a philosopher needs to be called one: virtues. The two needs for anyone to be called a philosopher are: one, pursuing the truth given by the eternal and unchangeable, this is wisdom, and two, to live a righteous life. If we look around us, there are a lot of people fulfilling both categories that don't have a degree in philosophy. Therefore, they can hope for the blessings promised for the philosophers in the afterlife and end their suffering caused by death itself. For if we live a righteous life, this is a life where we looked to the good by the good itself, then we can hope Plato's promises is waiting for us. And combining that with an honest and humble, righteous life, inquiry of the truth, then death won't be looked so scary. I'm about to finish. One last thing I would like to point out is that for Plato, particularly in Phaedrus, all the answers philosophers have been searching for will finally unveil when the soul liberates from the community of the body. The body serves as a virtue factory and a primary access to wisdom through recollection, so that the soul can purify itself in this life and harvest in the afterlife everything sown in this one. What we really fear about death may not be death itself, but the reflection death provides about our lives. For, in according to Plato, it will be in death when we will be able to reveal our true self. Death mirrors us back the life we lived and visualizes whether if we had a life worth living for or if we didn't. Finally, we can answer the questions given above. What type of life do we have in the afterlife? It all depends on the type of life we have in this one. We have had in this one. Will there be an examination of my life after death? Yes, there will be, as the final myths of Phaedrus, Gorgius, and Book 10 of Republic teaches us. And finally, who or whom will be in charge of this examination? The gods Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Icus. Reading Plato and discussing it in a classroom can help students get through tough times. Besides, we help them be the philosophers they can be, whatever they are studying, and stay in tune. Thank you.
All right. Roberto has solved the whole problem of death. I'm relieved.
I don't think. I'm just trying to give students another way to understand life.
No, and it was very helpful. So we had, both the content and the insight into pedagogy. And we began with Ron's, which was very helpful too for teaching purposes. Do folks have questions as of yet? Michelle, I forgot to greet you. You were on the other screen before. I hope I've said hello to everybody. Christina, did I say hello to you? And Phil, I appreciate everybody being here. Let's get some questions hopping here. What are folks thinking? I was interested in the musical metaphor that you were talking about, Roberto, because it's in the Theaetetus as well. The very first back and forth between Socrates and Theaetetus has to do with the tuning of the musical instrument, and I mentioned it in my paper. So that was an interesting thing to pick up on in your paper.
Yeah, thank you, Paige. Yeah, well, I believe my PhD was about music and math in Plato's philosophy, so that's why I have a kind of a feeling for these words or these metaphors, because I was trying to understand the Phaedrus philosophy as the highest music, and then what does that really mean in Plato's philosophy? And I find a lot these metaphors, and I find them very helpful to understand not only Plato's philosophy but human beings.
Let's think about things that occurred to you as folks were talking.
I have a question for Ron. Ron, could you say a little bit more about the move to the notion of quality in stasis theory? What do you mean? What is meant by quality, and how is it different than other?
I think it really means more than what I'm going to say right now. But I think for the purposes for teaching, and I'm right now, I've moved to a university that focuses entirely on undergraduate education. That was a little different when I was teaching graduate students, but I think for the purposes, when I'm teaching undergraduates, I kind of open the window to discussions of quality just by saying, let's just look at once we have certain definitions on the table, which do we find better, which do we find more useful, which do we find to be best, and kind of setting the frame for discussions about quality, around the definitions themselves. I think it's clear in the dialogues it does mean more than that, but I think that opens the door to the kinds of moves that I like seeing students make in trying to create these stasis-driven arguments.
Do you find when you're working with the students that, let's say, just to kind of create a, that they come up to the questions they're constructing and working with definitions, where they would say, which definition do I find the most or the more, insert adjective? Is there actually this point where they're saying useful or more accurate or feels right? Or
Yeah, and I think that's a way of getting at warrants, right, without calling them or unstated assumptions, or as a way, and that's without having to call it that, and get them to work through that process without having to attach a really more formal way of analyzing enthymemes as they relate to syllogisms. I think it's almost kind of a more natural way of intervening in that thinking.
or maybe even there's a kind of in-tuneness, because maybe there's a point to say, it doesn't sound right. I know I need to define it this way.
Yeah, absolutely.
In order to win, but it takes me into uneasy territory.
Yeah, and I agree. I do think there's a music to it, right? I mean, you could see in the little dialogue example that I threw up there, that there was this huge space between where the student went, where the student wanted to cut that off and have the professor just immediately concede. I think music's a kind of a wonderful way to talk about it. You can hear that fall flat, right? And so yeah, I love the introduction of that idea.
And just one other question, just so I won't ask any more than just one more, but I'm so excited about this. Did you get a sense from them, and share how you got a sense from them, if you did, that their notion of winning and doing well on the assignment changed?
I mean, you asked me that question in a more general way earlier, and I've been thinking about that quite a bit, and no, but to be honest, I did not assess that, but the next time I teach it, I will. I think I'm going to.
I wasn't really, I mean, even just not assessing, did you get a feel? Because there is a sense in which I think it's a hope, that we would want our students to, almost as if you give them an assignment and they would say, yes, finally, yippee, rather than I get to do this, and this could be exciting. What a great ride this would be. Oftentimes it is, it could, the range from, what do I have to do to get an A? This is a required course. This, we're trying to, in some sense, with an assignment, get them interested.
Right.
So I'm wondering if as they were working through the dialogue, were there moments where the students seemed to get interested?
I think so. I mean, I think even in that case where where the student eventually started to, just because I kept asking, would the professor really concede this point immediately, right? That by making that an actual character, and then the character actually comes to life in a sense. I mean, those were the best moments, right? Is where the student appeared to stop thinking about what they want to say, but actually what these characters would actually say in reality. I do think that was a moment where there was at least a shift, that in the better cases. I mean, I think that's when the characters actually come alive, I guess, to use some of my creative writing background as well,
Right.
that's,
Or where
that is-
Socrates pretends he's Protagoras, where he
right. Yeah.
and he, I don't know, and Theodorus says, I don't know if Protagoras were to emerge from the ground with just looking up, I don't know if he would say yes. Or
Yeah.
so impersonation may be a way into something.
Role playing and
Yeah.
I think there's some of that going on quite a bit in Diaetetus. But I also think it's there's a line between psychodrama and role playing. Where does the role end, and what is genuine, what reveals the unconscious, and psychodrama. But all these things I think are pertinent to our papers and how you understand Plato. Let's think some more.
I was thinking that music is probably the best metaphor for the type of learning that I was talking about between Plato and Smith too, right? Where there's sets of skills, but it's more the content. And it's like I was just pondering to think about how we would describe that process in music, whereby you learn a piece and you do a piece, and there's like all these skills and methods by which you did that, and yet every time you perform it, it's different, right? Like it's not the same yesterday, today, or tomorrow. Even if it's the same piece and the same instrument and the same player, there's something that's always new. And I don't know. I was just thinking about how to articulate that as one of the components of a learning process, or that's sort of getting at a metaphor for the goal that's always moving, the non-solidness of the knowledge we're trying to get to. Just a thought, not really a
Same
question.
thing is true in theater. A play is the same way.
Mhm.
What I find really fascinating is that throughout, for instance, the Theaetetus, we keep coming back to arithmetic, to geometry, to astronomy, and to music. And in essence, to put it in terms of the education of the Middle Ages, it's the quadrivium rather than the trivium, right? And yet we conclude with music, really, and music is what? It is this mathematical thing that expresses pure emotion, that somehow brings the two together.
Mm.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to jump in here. Thank you, Patrick. Because math, we can see it like it has this music has this mathematician precision. A note is a note, and it cannot be another note. But every time you play it, as you say, different. Or why do we like the fifth from this the fifth from this director or from this other director, and not, well, because not everyone plays it the same way, even though are the same notes. That's one of the things. And the other thing I find really helpful with music in teaching, here in my university, we read Republic 4. And at the end, we see after the tripartite part of the soul, the harmony part. And I point out harmony in Greek. Harmony means perfect tension, okay? And I even bring my guitar and I tell them, well, what is perfect tension? My sixth string, if I play it, it gives us the note E. Well, for it to have E, you have to tension it. If you tension it a little bit more, it gives you another note. If you tense it a little bit less, it gives you another note. Human beings and virtues are like a guitar. You have to tune them daily. You play it, they allow you to play a song, and then you have to tune it again. It's like living. You live and you tune yourself again.
But there's also in the issue of, notes in between and well, in jazz, of course, improvisation, but, what's done in playing blues sometimes, I can't remember what the term is when you slide a note, creating something in the middle, so to speak. Not exactly, but bending a note and that kind of thing. I was also thinking about the term stasis that Ron was talking about, and how that relates to Roberto's observations about death and preparation for death. And since I don't know stasis theory at all, maybe it would help if you explained it a little bit for the non-rhetoric people. Or am I the only one who doesn't know what? Yeah.
Well, I'm a budding one, so I'm still learning too.
But maybe help us understand what stasis is a little bit better and why it's important.
Is that for me, Paige?
Yeah, I guess so. Or
Well,
anybody can jump in.
Yeah, I was trying to remember. I think is it Hermagoras Rose, probably. It's kind of the rhetorician is that right, David? Yeah, that picked us up, and it's kind of working off of a document that doesn't exist and other people writing about it, right? So, but in the sense that it's a formal method for coming to conclusions with arguments that go through the categories of, first you lay out all the definitions, you argue about the quality of those definitions, and then come to stasis on the basis of the truth. Well, I mean, I think in the generative sense, right, the truth of which are better, which are more useful, which are best. I mean, depends on what the interlocutors are deciding. This is what we want to base policy on. So, so you have definitions, you have arguments about the quality, but then you also have to have agreement on what we're aiming for. Is it, if you, is the best, are we looking for the best movie of 2002, a better movie from 2002, right? I mean, like that argumentative term has to agree on, but it's moments of agreement that people are trying to reach, or in Plato's dialogues too, sometimes the characters just leave the dialogue instead of actually coming to stasis, but at the end of the discussion, and so it often gets used in legal circles too, stasis theory.
There's,
I don't know. That's probably, I'm hoping that's close enough for government work, which most of what I do is just close enough for government work anyway. So
there's like the four categories, right? There's what is its nature? And first the two would work through the idea of what the nature of a thing is. Then what are the definitions that are applicable to that? Then you can look at it in terms of its qualities, the greater and the lesser. And then finally the policy, what should we do? Yeah.
So it's a little bit, when in a dialectical context, when it has come together and successfully, or
You can, Ron's right. When we talk about stasis theory, it's like it's a text that doesn't exist anymore. Well, trace to Hermagoras, but you can see that they're categories of topics for an argument, and we see that Plato uses them himself. Like, for instance, what is the nature of this thing? Right? When he asks what is knowledge, then we kind of go through, how do we define it, or what is its nature when we say it's X, things like that. And it's an effort to come together. One of the things that stasis theory can do is show you whether or not you're even talking about the same issue. One of the examples that some of the textbooks give, I mean, the modern contemporary textbooks give, would be if you take the issue of abortion and apply stasis theory to it, what you can discover is we're not arguing about the same thing. We're talking about two different topics, because
right.
when you walk through those pieces, you discover that the two sides are not, they don't see it as the same nature. They don't define it the same way. So it thus doesn't have the same kinds of qualities for both sides.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Sorry, sounds to me like stasis theory, with its emphasis on definitions, is predominantly a deductive procedure. And both Paige and Roberto, I thought, were presenting metaphors for what knowledge is, or what knowledge might be like. One of them, familial relationships, parental and filial relationships in Paige's talk, and a musical instrument for Roberto, which seems to me the opposite of a deductive procedure. And I wanted to ask all three of you what kind of guidance we get from the Theaetetus or any other dialogue as to whether finally the inductive metaphorical path is our highest insight, or the more mathematical deductive path.
Well, certainly what you remember about Theaetetus is very much those metaphors. You know, the midwife, you're not going to forget that. You're not going to forget the wax block or the aviary. Those powerful and extended metaphors certainly, maybe it's because I'm a literature person, that's what I hold on to. And as my colleagues in our little Plato group know, I'm phobic about the math. So I'm going to cling to what I understand a little better. But other folks help here.
My reading would be that it's both and, right? Like Plato is in the first questions, he's taking down inductive knowledge as producing anything final, right? Because it ends up being relative to everyone's experience. But then the deductive process, I don't think gives you final results either. They're both methods to learn, right? Like there's skills to have, then you need them, but there's not neither of them are going to yield an absolute final thing that you can transfer. It's more the processes and the application. That would be my guess.
Seems to me the nature of the dialectic is modus tollens, which is deductive. Socrates is always giving counterexamples as a way of advancing the discussion. I'm not sure if I'd say that modus tollens, the denial, establishes knowledge in some final way, but it seems to move, at least move the dialectic in an important direction. So I vote for deduction, non-mathematical. I hope that's good for Paige. It is for me.
And I think that maybe we can relate to the allegory of the cave and everything that goes on in Republic 7. There, I think Plato weaves the inductive and deductive knowledge all together. First, through this image, the cave, the prisoners, and all these elements he's giving us. And after that, he comes with the pedagogical system of math that ends in the dialectic, which is being able to think without hypothesis. So I think we can, I don't know, search for some answers there, Joy. I don't know, but that's a good question.
Roberto, help
Seems to
me. I'm sorry. I missed somebody. Michael, were you saying something?
I was, thank you. I was going to say that the allegory of the cave can be understood, I think, as a critique of induction, particularly if you look at the prisoners in the game that the prisoners are playing. They're predicting the next figure to come based on the repeated experiences they have. In other words, induction by enumeration. And Socrates is pretty clear. This is kind of a loop of ignorance that the prisoners are experiencing. Now, what's the alternative? I guess some kind of enlightenment or maybe a non-cognitive process. I'm not sure about that, but certainly induction is not a favorite, particularly since it sticks us in sensation and sense perception and so on. I don't see that as having a prominent role in Plato or Socrates.
It's almost like if it's needed an insight there, so for the prisoner to be able to liberate, even though that the text tells us that someone liberates the prisoner. It's not the prisoner himself liberating, it's someone liberating the prisoner.
That's the teacher.
Yeah.
That's us. It is we.
Yeah. It is Socrates.
Yep.
No, I didn't know that. I always thought it was the prisoner finds his chains have broken and then begins to explore, but I don't know. I'd be willing to be corrected on that. Who it is that does the liberating is a good question.
I would just want to point out, though, that at least in the composing process, writers, I think, probably move inductively and apply deductive category, at least in engaging the stasis, right? If you're writing characters based on stasis, I think that starts inductively in motion and then works with deduction as you go forward.
I was gonna say, I mean, I could be wrong, but my my understanding from his critique of sense perception at Theaetetus, at least, is that it's a necessary beginning, right? Like you want to quickly move past, you want to quickly get beyond it, but you still have to have it, an inductive, sensory, observational kind of beginning. Is that, would you agree with that, Michael, or is that?
No, I don't exactly agree with that, but I'm not sure. I'm no expert on Plato, certainly. And he does speak of looking at the objects of sense perception and then getting a sense of forms out of that, at least in some of the places. So yeah, I think there is some role for that in some of the dialogues, but again, I can't say that for sure. I certainly wouldn't reject that. Sounds more
And
like Aristotle.
That would not be the first or the last time.
yeah, but in fact, what you are saying, Rosalind, it is in Phaedo. In Phaedo, Plato begins all the recollection thanks to the sense perception. So sense perception is inevitable. We need it,
Yeah.
but we have to flip it as fast as we can. But he's not rejecting it as many have thought about.
It seems like he's most interested all the time in just showing the limitations of something, but even in the deductive stuff, you know, like you present a perfectly beautiful, like deductive syllogism and he'll quickly show you where it's insufficient, right?
Well, I think of Socrates mainly as disproving ignorance rather than as establishing some kind of knowledge in a way that's justificatory. At least the Socrates character is not teaching, as he says, you know, he's simply critiquing and challenging hypotheses, which may come from sense perception, may come from, who knows, gossip or whatever, or just
In the early dialogue, Meno, though, Socrates isn't just, he is criticizing in one sense, where he's showing the slave boy the wrongness of the proposed answer, but he's also guiding, and in fact, there also turns out to be a correct result of how you double the square. And so it doesn't end up in a cloud of tentativeness or in a unresolved way. There, in that one example at least, there's a inescapable, definite resolution.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Of course, it's a mathematical process, not a sense perception, so to speak. And it's recollection.
It's mathematical, but he doesn't ask if the slave boy has learned math. All he asks is, does the slave boy speak Greek? And that seems to be the only required credential for participating in this process.
That was a big credential, I think, for the Greeks.
Michelle.
Could I ask you regarding induction and deduction for anybody who wants to answer from the ancient texts? Catherine Schultz, who writes beautifully, she used to write at the New Yorker. I think she's somewhere in the West Coast now. She has a full-length book called Evidence. And in that book, there's a section about induction and deduction. And she goes to an extreme. She gives an example about why artificial intelligence continues to fail in all the testing that's being done. And the idea is, it sounds like Plato thinks that induction is inferior because it's based on sense perception. Do I have that right? In her chapter on induction, she kind of says the opposite of that. So she says the reason why AI fails is because it's not able to induct. So one of the picture examples in the chapter is there's a picture of it's a giraffe's neck, you know, so you can see almost the full length of the giraffe's neck. And then she places a box in front of part of the neck. And she says a computer cannot induct that there's a giraffe neck behind the box. So I was wondering if you could compare that to what you've been saying about induction and deduction, if that spawns any ideas. I'd love to hear.
Michelle is my former colleague, by the way. I claim her. Everything brilliant she says from here on, I take credit.
You know, there's a toy that was out a while ago. I'm not sure what it was called, but it was like a 20 questions game. One player would think about something and have, pick an object, and then the other player would ask questions. And after 4 or 5 questions, this machine would give the answer. And some of the I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about here. It's an extraordinary toy because it gives correct answers out of nowhere, but it's based upon induction. In other words, the program knows that after certain questions have been answered, some certain conclusions have been reached, not in terms of any kind of valid deductive argument, but simply in terms of familiarity with the repetition of cases and what follows them. So it's kind of like the game played in in Plato's cave as well. Registering a number of antecedent conditions and then predicting based upon the assumption that the future resembles the past. So I don't understand about AI. I don't see why AI. Well, that's a fairly complicated example, but it seems to me AI works pretty well for very routine kind of programs. It is a deductive system, right?
And I think, can you hear me? I think what the way I understand it is that Schultz would say that it is less beautiful, that the thinking of AI is less beautiful because it's not able to induct, be wrong, learn from that, and then create a new metaphor. I think in a new, more adaptive, more beautiful metaphor cannot result because AI can't go back and forth the same way that we do between the two kinds. So in the chapter, she uses that lack of ability to induct as a way of explaining how we're still ahead of AI, and but also it's our weakness. If we induct too much, especially based on previous negative experiences, then we sort of predetermine like the way we see future things. So it's like it's a weakness as well as a strength that I think she's trying to describe that AI cannot do. Thank you.
Think of chess playing programs. Would that count as AI? And the process that the program does is completely different from what a human being does in terms of the iterations of possibilities and so on. So it's not as pretty as human reasoning.
Well, that's an interesting case because of the way that they finally were able to get computers to win at chess. That for the longest time they were trying to get computers to learn the rules and the strategies well, and program them, sort of from above, but eventually discovered that, well, actually, if you just get 2 computers to play an infinite number of games against each other, that they improve much faster, which I think does relate to a deductive process versus an inductive process. I mean, my suspicion is that the more situations that we're able to throw AI into that work, that build from the ground up like that I mean, I do think they will eventually, carbon-based life will decline and silicon-based life will be on the rise. in the next 100 years. But hopefully hopefully they love us. I'm working with the assumption that that they're going to, like Tipler says, right, that some sense they're going to bring us to the omega point, and that's that the omega point loves us. But I don't have any proof. No proof of that at all, just hope.
So I have a question for Ron, and it goes back to the pedagogy discussion. So as I was listening to your presentation, I work with students of color. I work in an HBCU, and I was thinking about how your assignment how has it worked when you are working with students of color? Because a lot of times this population has not necessarily, I don't think they see themselves like trying to emulate Plato's style, let alone read him. And also, with stasis theory, you're kind of coming up with like your own truth, right? And that's not something that students of color they don't have a lot of opportunity for that. So I think your assignment is really, it can be empowering for these kinds of populations. And I was wondering how have you seen it play out in your classrooms with these kinds of students?
And Montclair State is a majority minority institution, a Hispanic serving institution. So there are a lot of similarities there. And I mean, just to be blunt there, I mean, I probably emphasize Plato less in my teaching right now. I give them short examples, and I also look for like a wider range of examples of dialogue. But the rules remain the same. The rules, the assignment remains the same. The rules remain the same. And I'm still really on the search for a wider range of material to use as models, because I think you're absolutely right. It puts up a block. I haven't found answers yet, but at the same time, I would say the results exactly the same. Some people struggle, some people do remarkably well, but the creation of the characters that just follow this certain set of rules, and the creativity that's kind of allowed in the assignment, I wouldn't say I see a difference, even though I do see in a lot of ways, I see a much more diverse set of characters in the dialogues themselves. And I think that's to be celebrated for sure.
Do you ever have discussions like reflection discussions, whether it's formal, like a formal writing assignment, or just conversation in class? Like, what did you think of the assignment?
I need to do more of that. I think, my conversation really made me think I need to, I need to get a better sense of what my students are thinking in relationship to this assignment itself. But I do bring into the discussion that, when we're reading Plato and Socrates, I do like to point out that they're not necessarily white.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I'm honestly thinking about like implementing this next semester, because I just think it's such a radically different assignment, and a lot of people are desperate for that. Even like professors themselves grading, the same types of essays over and over. It gets really routine. So anything to break up the monotony is good.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I'll definitely want to stay in conversation with you about it.
Well, it's interesting. Scott Lee's new book, Invention, the Art of Liberal Arts, is recommending heavily. By the way, there's a plenary session about it Friday morning, if anybody's interested. It's the 9:00 session on it. But he is pushing much more now than when I first met him and first got introduced to ACTC, into creative assignments of the kind that Ron was showing us.
Oh, and I have to mention, I'm sorry to interrupt, Paige, but I do have to mention that David Metzger was my teacher and had me write dialogues for him. So that's just a shout out. So I'm happy to talk with Christina.
Credit, credit to David, credit.
Yeah. So.
But it seems to be, I mean, people have always been in favor of creativity, but within the ACTC ethos and world, it's getting an extra injection, I think, at this point, of people trying to do creative things with Cortex. And Scott is particularly enthusiastic about everything that has to do with student writing and performance, very much into performance. So if you get a chance to come and hear him Friday, that might be fun. What do we think, guys? Are we worn out and ready for a little afternoon rest?
I had a question for Rose, if I could.
Sure, David.
You mentioned nap.
I've been waiting, David.
You mentioned nap, and I don't know. Now I'm feeling pretty guilty.
My mind went to tea.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in what you shared with us in the chat, and I'm particularly interested. This idea that there exists in the mind of every man, anyway, the notion of a standard, and at one general, I mean, if you could say a little more about that, because I think every once in a while Plato will also, I mean, I'm trying to remember, I may even have it here, the word that made me think of a standard. Now, I think in Greek it's, and Roberto, check me on this, I think it's kriterion.
Mm-hmm.
And Plato also situates that inside. So my question has to do, why does this standard have to be inside? And then, you know, anytime anyone starts talking about the demigod and starts populating the inside with agents, I'm interested in how those agents are figured. So I'm wondering about the choice of a demigod here. Demigod. I don't know enough about Smith to know if does he use the word demigod in other places, or where he may have gotten it from, or even just logically in terms of certain habits of thought he has, why he will insist on having an agent or a producer who creates this product, aka standard.
That's a great question. I think it has to do with the process by which the demigod is formed. And to my knowledge, he doesn't use that in any other context at all. Because it's formed via, so that external standard, the principle attention to the first standard, an idea of exact propriety and perfection, is an ideal that's formed via interaction and use of the faculties, right? So it comes from basically your own levels of conceptual abstraction from your experience of ideas in life. So I think that he refers to the demigod like as a third person almost, because it's almost, in another passage, I should find it, but in another passage, he talks about it almost as if it's an external judge in your own mind. It's like the way that we objectively judge our own character. That's what he's getting at. Like it could just be described as like a conscience, but he describes it as like a demigod because I think it has that power of judgment over you, right? and it functions as like a almost external self in the self by that process of experiential, like contextualizing, right? Like experiential knowledge, which leads you to contextualize yourself. Once you are able to contextualize yourself deeply enough, you basically have an outside voice in your head, you know, kind of interpolating your actions with what you know about everybody else.
Is it akin to the superego for Freud?
I don't know enough about Freud to answer that, to be honest. I don't think so, because I don't think he sees it as necessarily arising from any kind of deep, unspoken inner desire necessarily, other than our desire to be lovely and loved.
Yeah.
I was trying to account for the contextual, what you were calling contextual or cultural, maybe, component that helps form the demigod. We don't do it all by ourselves, or do we?
No, not at all. But then the self that we form in the self, right? Like the demigod, in a certain sense, acts externally because we don't necessarily have control over it, right? Like if the process is undertaken with acuity, or, you know, like as much accuracy as possible, it's not like you could tell your demigod to like look away, right? Or pull any mind tricks on your own conscience.
Are you sure about that?
Well, I think in a system you wouldn't necessarily be able to. Like it's not completely subjective, even if it's formed internally and exists internally, because it's, you know, because it's that check and balance with like everything that you've ever experienced externally in a like economy of sentiments.
I wonder, do you think it could be something like a simulation of self in the world? And the reason I pick on the word simulation is that I was thinking of that moment in the Sophists where in the Benedetti translation, he makes a distinction between, there's a distinction between, what is it, the icastic and the mimetic. You know, and it seemed to me that the icastic has about it a kind of simulation that is, in the sense that it's also productive, but you can also judge it in a sense, in as much as it is productive. And at precisely, or you know, at that moment where that wonderful word criterion is introduced into the Theaetetus, he starts talking about the future. About the will arguments, right? And somehow, and then he builds the difference between, well, maybe some people are wiser than others, some people are experts, some people aren't. So we have to do something more with the external, in order to judge, we have to do something more than simply imitate, which you might say would be a mimetic representation. We have to model it, you know.
Right.
If you're getting all fancy schmancy, or if not fancy schmancy, grandiloquent, you know, that wonderful moment in Richard Feynman's introduction to his lectures on physics, where I can't imagine him telling first year students this, but okay, where he said, over the course of the next 2 semesters, we will take from the heavens each star and then systematically put them back up. You know, that in some way that physics is a simulation. It isn't just a description or a representation of the world. It puts you in a position where that once you've taken away from the world, you know exactly where to put it back.
I think that is exactly what he's getting at, and I would go for that also because of his emphasis on poetry. and literature, right? Like that icastic would exist in a literary artifact in an, like the art and the criticism and interpretation of art. I think maybe that demigod is like your own inner critic, like in the sense that, and I also think of it in terms of like, in terms of like judging of moral action, right? If you take the judgment as occurring contemporaneously with perception, which the common sense realist tradition does, and I think Smith also does, then the only way that you would intervene in that, I mean, this might be where he differs from Freud too, is that the only way you would intervene in that is if there would be that future thinking self that can then revise prior to, right? Like, so the way you read a novel and then you think of some situation in your own life of what would so-and-so do in this situation, right? Like it's that simulacra of self with art. I don't know, that probably made it way more vague, but.
No, I got a little bit more that time.
Well, there, good.
Friends, we are going to have to stop. However, 3:15 is the limit because they kind of use these rooms.
Mhm.
Joe is probably laughing up his sleeve, our tech genius. They're using the room. Quick, clear the room. But there is something kind of like that going on, that these Zoom rooms are, is that the way it
Yeah,
works? Joe,
that
can
is-
you?
It is sort of like that. There's only about 10 or 12 different Zoom rooms that the conference is using. So in order to move on to the next session, you have to clear the people out of the room. Sometimes it's not in use for the next time slot, and so it doesn't really matter, but sometimes it is. So that's how it works.
Zoom rooms. I can't believe we actually are talking this way. Clear the Zoom room.
Thank you for those wonderful papers.
And
Yes,
thanks so much.
yeah.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be in
all
this.
of
you.
Thank
And,
you.
Yeah,
and
thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, Roberto.
Yeah.
outside guests and
I'll see if I can
inside
find
guests.
I'll see if I can find your dissertation, Roberto. Music and math. Two
Yeah.
good at, but I love.
I will have to translate it first because I wrote it in Spanish, but
No, I'll give it a shot.
He can do
okay,
it.
I have it in academia.edu. In fact, there's a book coming our way soon, like in a week. My PhD was I was able to publish it, so
Oh, wow.
Oh, okay.
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
He
Let
wants
us know.
he wants
I'll
you
let
to
you
pay
know.
for it, David.
Well, I'll have the
you to buy it.
library pay for it. No, the library will pay for it. Yeah.
I'm
I'm
glad.
messing with you.
Take
All right.
care.
To be
Thank you
continued
so
tomorrow.
much.
Yep.
Take
See
care.
you all
All right,
Bye. See you all tomorrow.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.